Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Yeah, so that happened. Welcome in the Commoners Podcast, everybody. Adam, how are you doing?
I'm actually somewhat excited.
Really?
Well, yeah, so you know how when you're coming up to a big speech or coming up to a big event, a big something that brings about a bit of anxiety, even an important test, you kind of have the anxiety and you have the nerves, but as soon as you kind of get up to the podium or you sit down and you actually see what is on the test, and suddenly like everything, like your adrenaline's up and you're just ready to go and you're pumped, you're excited. That's kind of where I'm at just now. So I spent all week kind of feeling a little bit anxious leading up to the moment. But now that it's here, now that we actually have a Trump presidency, it's like, yeah, let's get on with it. Let's do it. Let's get moving.
I can kind of identify with that, but at the same time, just sort of looking at what he did even on the first day, and then what he's promised to do, and you know the things that he's likely to do starting on Monday. He's considering his first day, by the way. You know, he gets inaugurated, and apparently presidents get the weekend off. Of course. So yeah, I mean, yes, in some ways it's like it was so surreal that he actually won the election, and there's been so much fear going up to the moment that you kind of didn't know what was happening. I mean, I legitimately thought that there was a chance for some sort of attack to happen, not necessarily in D.C., but worldwide, because the security in D.C., it was like a fortress.
Yep.
On
Most
Friday.
secure place on the planet, I think.
Right, but my thought was more along the lines of like embassies and things around the world. Generally around things like this, that's when you see sort of retaliatory attacks, especially with Trump's rhetoric on Muslims and Islam in the Middle East. I had trepidation going into yesterday, but I'm glad everything went off without a hitch, mostly.
A little bit of protesting going on, a few arrests. I think it was upwards around 100 the last time I checked last evening.
Yeah, and even that continued throughout the weekend. On Saturday, there was, around the country, there was women marching.
Yeah. In fact, here in Scotland as well, actually. It truly was a global phenomenon, the Million Women March happening in Edinburgh, Glasgow, down in London, across Europe. So he's certainly one to have stirred up a lot of passion globally.
I remember at the time when Trump was campaigning for president, there was this big story that came out. It was like a scandal almost, where Susan Sarandon had done an interview where she said basically, if it was between Trump and Hillary, she might almost root that Trump wins, because if you had seen how much Bernie galvanized the liberal base, right, in the United States,
right,
she, I think, was of the thought process that a Trump presidency would galvanize the left in a way that a Hillary presidency wouldn't have.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And I think you're kind of seeing that across the country, although it is being cast by conservatives as just being butthurt about the whole thing.
Loser palooza, I think, was the term used by Breitbart.
And I mean, every single conservative that I know, including myself at the time of Obama being elected, I've told you I cried the night that Barack Obama was elected.
That's right.
Including myself, we were saying all along, oh, he's not my president, I'm not going to give him a chance. And now those same people are turning around and saying, oh, how can you say he's not your president? You have to give him a chance. Give him 100 days.
At the same time, I think it's fair to admit that the folks that for the past 8 years under the Obama administration have felt as if the country has been going in the wrong direction they do have reason to kind of celebrate today. Finally, you've got an administration that's back on the right, back in the Republican wing. So,
yeah, for now.
For now. The question is whether it actually begins diverting from kind of what I would consider, your standard liberal right-wing position, and more towards the authoritarian.
Yes.
In the same way that some of the European parties have been going recently.
I definitely think that it has the potential to do that, especially with some elements that we saw in Trump's speech, which we'll get to later. But I think both of us can unequivocally say that the riots, protesting, violence, breaking windows of Bank of America and McDonald's in Washington, D.C., that's absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, there's no point in damaging property. Get out, share what you want to share, yell as loud as you want, but there's no point in damaging anything.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, I mean, something that's always been my blueprint for successful protesting and successful peaceful resistance is something like Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Where, you know what, people might not pay attention to you, they might not listen to you, but eventually they're going to know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in the situation. I mean, unequivocally now we look back in the history and, the Alabama sheriffs who were soaking people with fire hoses, sicking dogs on people who were peacefully protesting. There's no gray area there. Nobody was attacking the police. It's absolutely 100% the moral arc of history as the moral arc of the universe, as Dr. King would call it. That will ultimately be on your side. If you are, I mean, just because somebody else is doing something wrong doesn't mean that you should then do something wrong. Two wrongs do not make a right. And so the protesters of yesterday won't be remembered like that.
Right.
And so I think you delegitimize your position by doing that. Violence, especially in protest, is never the answer unless I would say, in like in a situation like in World War II, that sort of thing, if it ever got to that level, then I think that violence would be maybe justified, but we're not quite there yet, So yesterday, I mean, you see, it's like it doesn't vindicate you. It actually vindicates, I think, conservatives who view liberals as these little intolerant people who throw hissy fits and damage property whenever they don't get their way.
Although the limo fire was spectacular. No, I ultimately I think you're right. Is that when kind of one of the rules that I agree with here, that particularly the Scottish government has been, or the SNP has been particularly good at here, is always portraying in opposition, in government, in referendum, always kind of portraying a positive case, a positive argument for your goal. And if that is going to include burned out limos and smashed windows, then you're already, as you say, doing a disservice to your own argument.
Yeah. So I think that's enough stalling. I think we have to get into the news, whether we want to admit it or not, or come to reality or not. Donald Trump was elected despite losing the popular vote by nearly 2.9 million votes. He was inaugurated on Friday as the 45th President of the United States. President Trump wasted no time in reaffirming his populist message that he had throughout most of his campaign.
Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning because today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
Trump also continued his attack on the establishment and their disconnection from average Americans. And he also reaffirmed his campaign promise of focusing on the needs of Americans who felt left behind.
The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. That all changes starting right here and right now, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. But for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities. rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge, and the crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Despite his early divisive words, Trump also called for unity as America moves forward after a tumultuous election.
We are one nation, and their pain is our pain. Their dreams are our dreams, and their success will be our success. We share one heart, one home, and one glorious destiny.
President Trump channeled his inner Bernie Sanders, blasting failed trade policies and promising a new era of protectionism and large infrastructure projects.
We've made other countries rich, while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon. One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores, with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed all across the world. But that is the past, and now we are looking only to the future. We will build new roads and highways and bridges and airports and tunnels and railways all across our wonderful nation. We will get our people off of welfare and back to work, rebuilding our country with American hands and American labor.
Being Donald Trump, he was also clear that his administration would always put America's interests first.
Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs.
Of course, as a Republican, he promised to defeat radical Islamic terrorism and appealed to his Christian base by confidently invoking God's protection.
We will reinforce old alliances and form new ones and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth. There should be no fear. We are protected, and we will always be protected. We will be protected by the great men and women of our military and law enforcement. And most importantly, we will be protected by God.
Trump also reiterated the need for a renewed commitment to nationalism.
At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. And through our loyalty to our country, we will rediscover our loyalty to each other. When you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. A new national pride will stir our souls, lift our sights, and heal our divisions. It's time to remember that old wisdom our soldiers will never forget, that whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots.
President Trump finished his speech with the all-too-familiar refrain that was so successful during his campaign.
Together, we will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And yes, together, we will make America great again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
Of course, not everyone was thrilled by Trump's inauguration. There were protests around the world. In Washington, D.C., some of these demonstrations turned violent, with some protesters smashing windows and starting fires. More level-headed liberals, including civil rights icon John Lewis, opted to boycott the inauguration altogether, calling Trump an illegitimate president. The new president is poised to have an eventful first day, which, according to him, will be Monday. Directly after his inauguration, Trump signed his first bill as president, allowing for the nomination of retired General James Mattis to serve as Secretary of Defense. He also signed several executive orders, including an order directing regulatory agencies to roll back regulations that were burdensome related to Obamacare. The administration also released several statements on whitehouse.gov promising to, quote, put America first by repealing Obama's climate action plan and clean water executive orders, among others. Other actions high on Trump's agenda include undoing Obama's executive actions on immigration, such as DACA, deferred action on childhood arrivals, repealing Obamacare, and developing a plan to defeat ISIS within 30 days. Reuters reports that Trump's advisors have vetted more than 200 potential executive orders for him to consider signing on healthcare, climate policy, immigration, energy, and numerous other issues, but it was not clear how many orders he would initially approve, according to a member of the Trump transition team who was not authorized to talk to the press. Trump is expected to sign an executive order in his first few days to direct the building of a wall on the southern border with Mexico and actions to limit the entry of asylum seekers from Latin America, among several immigration-related steps his advisors have recommended. What a day. Adam, you obviously watched the inauguration. What are your thoughts? And what's the response been across the pond?
Yeah, yes, I was able to watch the inauguration live. It was a great event to see the patriotic unfurling of Americana unveil itself before the watching world. It was an interesting speech.
The pageantry was incredible.
The pageantry is great. There's never a point in which I expect a national event like an inauguration or over here, for instance, the opening of the Parliament every year, to not take on big symbolic national symbols, pageantry, pride, all this good stuff. So, I mean, that was fun to look at. It was nice to see America kind of decked out in its glory. But we were promised during the campaign, and more specifically before the inauguration itself, that we were going to have a populist, a nationalist, and a Make America Great Again speech. And that is what we got. The populist element of giving the country back to the people is that's standard populist rhetoric. The nationalist America First rhetoric, the patriotic rhetoric was quite substantial in there as well. So that is what we expected. That's what we knew we were going to get with Trump. The scariest thing, I think, particularly on the nationalist point, particularly with the patriotism, what was the line again? It's when you I think it was when you open your heart to patriotism, there's no room for prejudice. That was.
I was scratching my head at that part. I didn't understand quite what he meant.
Right. Now, I think what he's trying to get at is, and this was kind of the main theme of his kind of unifying aspects of the speech, is that if we all agree or if we all take pride in our country, then within that pride of the country, we'll see ourselves as equal and there will be no prejudice between us. But what it came across as is, it did kind of come across as kind of 1920s, 1930s European rhetoric, which, was predominantly...
absolutely
legitimately right-wing nationalists at the time. And my biggest issue is, well, who gets to define patriotism? Is it an American brand of patriotism? Is it the Trump administration that gets to define patriotism? Is it a communal-based definition by which we all agree what is patriotic? It's that kind of worries me the most, because then what can end up happening, and what has happened in the past, is that when the administration defines patriotism and you suddenly find yourself outside of those limits, you suddenly become both unpatriotic and against the will of the nation.
Correct. I don't know how prevalent this is over in Europe. Obviously, I never lived in Europe, but in the United States, there's this feeling of America being a melting pot, right? Where many cultures, many races come, but what unifies us is that we are Americans, right? And so by coming to the country, you sign on to the culture of America, right? The pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the American dream, you sign on to all these ideas, and what binds Americans together is not skin color or nationality. What binds us together is being Americans, the liberal ideals that make you an American. So being an American is more of a philosophical thing, I think, throughout the past than it has been about, always having lived here, and so because of that, there's this idea that immigrants are expected coming here to assimilate and to assimilate completely and to accept American culture, regardless of where you came from.
Right.
So America would never be open to something like multiculturalism. That's a taboo word over here, multiculturalism, because, and I think this is sort of the point that Trump was trying to get to, is that the very specific brand of American patriotism that we have is there can't be prejudice because you are dedicated to the same set of ideals of America. It's very idealistic. It's very it has this mythos to it. It's very or mythos, I should say. It's that's embedded in American culture, I think.
It's actually an idea that I agree with. Like that, the whole idea of building your nation around a particular political philosophy is essentially civic nationalism. The issue is, so there are essentially two different types of nationalism. You've got civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. The ethnic nationalism is kind of obvious. You build your nationality around your ethnicity. So the Scots are an ethnicity and a nation, and you build your nationalism around that. The French are the same. The Croats are the same. Civic nationalism is more kind of the melting pot idea by which you're all bound together, not by any particular ethnicity or by blood, but by a political philosophy. The problem I've seen, and the irony or paradox almost, is that where in Scotland, for instance, we have a legitimate claim on ethnic nationalism, the prevailing nationalism that exists here is civic. And where in America, the only claim that can really be made in terms of nationalism in America is to civic nationalism, because there is no American ethnicity.
Correct.
It is a melting pot.
Right.
Nonetheless, the nationalism that has grown up in America, particularly the one that's backing Trump, is predominantly ethnic. So you've got this strange paradox in which the ethnic country is going civic and the civic country is going nationalist, going ethnic.
That is true. I haven't really thought about it that way. What you do see is the fear mongering that you get about Sharia law is it's the idea that people are coming here and not assimilating to the American values. But what bothers me and makes me fearful, not quite fearful yet, but it's kind of a wait and see mentality right now. The problem with me is that conservative administrations have never been great at defining patriotism. And we haven't been helped by Obama's administration. Obama, when he was campaigning, said that he would, not punish whistleblowers, but there's I think it's the Espionage Act or something like that, but he has used that more than any other president to punish whistleblowers and people who have leaked documents like Snowden, like Chelsea Manning, who, in my mind, they are the definition of patriots. They love their country and they love it enough to tell it what it's doing wrong and expose what it's doing wrong so that the people know. Like they are there and trying to help the people keep the government accountable. And the problem is, I don't think that Trump or any conservative government really wants to be held accountable.
Right. Perhaps another paradox in the system is that where the Republicans in particular tend to worry about big government because of government overstep, they're also the first to believe in the government when it says that what it's doing is both moral and ethical, and that whistleblowers are in fact the immoral and the unethical ones.
Yeah.
That always surprises me that the folks that don't back big government are the first to jump to its defense whenever something is actually leaked.
Right. And it's like, these are the people, like you said, don't trust government at all, but they completely trust the government to always get the right people for Guantanamo Bay, for instance, which we know we don't. There was I forget the guy's name, I'm blanking on it right now, but there was a German citizen that we held there, and actually no, it wasn't there. It was at a black site, CIA black site. I forget which country it is, but we tortured the guy for like 40 days and kept him, and then we had to. We actually went to the German government. We're like, can you keep this on the down low? And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. You captured one of our citizens who doesn't have any ties to terrorism, and you tortured the guy, and it because of the fact that there is no due process. That's why you need due process. That's why, that's how we've been doing it in common law for years upon years. It's one of the most basic ideas in a liberal society where people are innocent until proven guilty. But conservatives are perfectly willing to trust the government that they're getting it right 100% of the time because, hey, they're Islamic, they're Muslim. What do I care? They're guilty because by association, basically,
Yeah, and I think that there could also be a claim there on, I'm not sure if manifest destiny is the right term, but essentially the idea that whatever America does is just and well, it's morally justified.
Oh, absolutely. There is an attitude in the United States that I see all the time where America is good by definition. So regardless of what we do, because our intentions were good, then, are bad, but basically we can't be held accountable for it. Like, we were trying to do the right thing. And I think that gets us into trouble all over the place. So what was the reaction around Europe to the inauguration?
Yeah, so Trump is obviously not the belle of the ball here in Europe at all. I think just last week in an interview with the Times, he's kind of gone on the record and saying that further European integration is not a good thing. He is pro-Brexit. He's had the National Front, their leader in France, visit Trump Tower before his ascendancy. Marine Le Pen, that's right.
Marine Le Pen.
And so he's essentially against further European integration, which, if you talk to Europeans, they're kind of divided on the issue, but the overwhelming feeling is that Europe has been good, that the EU has been a good thing. There is no other country other than Britain at the moment, perhaps Greece and perhaps the Netherlands at some point, that has the majority of the people wanting to leave the EU. And so, especially at a time where you've got Russia on Europe's east, it's not necessarily a time when you want to begin dividing your allies. And so the fact that Trump has come out essentially saying that, no, you guys probably shouldn't be... the reason, or one of the biggest pushes behind the EU initially was America. One of the biggest arguments for Britain, or proponents for Britain entering the EU, was America pushing it into the EU, saying that this is a good thing. And arguably it is, for defence of Europe, for a continent that is so close-knit together, that has so many cultural, political, social differences. For them to be knit together it's just good. It brings peace to the continent, and arguably the EU has been successful. It has been with its faults, and obviously Brexit kind of brought some of those out a little bit more. But it is in the national interest of the US for the EU to stick together, and for Trump to then come out and say otherwise is kind of a shock to the system here.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that, because it's interesting to me how quickly people forget history, right? I mean, you had Europe, a continent that literally had 2 world wars in the span of 30 years. Yeah,
I mean, arguably you could call it the same war. It was the problems of World War I that brought on World War II. But nonetheless, centuries of warfare over the continent, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would assume that this is probably the most peaceful time that there's ever been in Europe's history. Probably ever, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, people forget, and again, I mean, their physical safety and economic safety is being threatened, and they're willing to sort of give up on things that, or at least in Brexit's case, give up on things that have been good for them.
Yeah. I think Russia in particular is a big thing here, because Trump's relationship with Putin is as of yet unknown. and we don't know how the Trump administration is going to interact diplomatically with the Russians. I think Trump is also on record as saying, or answering the question, who do you trust more, Merkel or Putin? And he said, well, I trust both equally. We'll see what happens in the future. And that's obviously a little bit of a worry, because now Europe is beginning to feel isolated. So what if, for instance, the Trump administration does actually begin to side more with Putin than with Merkel? And Trump decides to maybe cast a slight blind eye to the Eastern Front, so that places like Ukraine, or at least Eastern Ukraine, get overrun a little bit more than it is. Perhaps Kaliningrad begins to threaten the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, even Estonia. Finland is an interesting case because it's not a NATO member, essentially because of Russia, and it has a military... what do you call it? It's not a draft. Essentially a necessity of serving in the military for a year before you head to university. They border Russia. Like, it's not an unknown threat. Russia can be hostile when it wants to. You see the Crimea and Ukraine.
I think right off the bat, we actually might get a chance to see Trump's attitude towards Russia, because Obama has been, along with NATO, assembling or amassing troops on the Eastern Front. Yep,
Britain itself has troops in Poland, and I believe in Lithuania. It's either Lithuania or Latvia.
Yeah, I guess we kind of have to wait and see how this all plays out. I mean, obviously, I don't think that Putin is a somebody that you want to trust, or not necessarily an actor who is 100% above board. You know, I don't think that his motivations are always pure, or if ever pure. But you did have this openly antagonistic escalation type talk with you now have it with progressives in the United States, which is kind of embarrassing. But like Obama, and with Hillary in particular, with her no-fly zone in Syria, for instance, which would have been a direct escalation against Russia. You kind of can't. Time will tell whether it's Putin looking out for his national security or wanting to get more influence abroad, which I think is probably a mix of both. But if I'm Putin and I'm looking at Trump, I probably view him as the less terrible option for Russia, because Trump had never really talked about escalating with Russia or anything. And so, his relationship with Russia obviously is unclear. But I think we're going to have to wait on that and sort of see how things go. I mean, if Putin tries to do power grabs and Trump just sort of lets it happen, then obviously that's a bad thing. But if it's when it comes down to policies in Syria that are not going to put us directly in conflict with Russia, then I'm sort of okay with it.
Right. More back on the idea of the blind eye to the Eastern Front. That's a big concern for Europe. The thought of, and I mean, in his inaugural address, Trump questioned NATO, the fundamental alliance, military alliance between Europe and North America, that has held essentially Russia at bay for the last few decades. And Europe is very much aware that it doesn't give financially in the way that it should. Many countries in Europe, in NATO, don't give the 2% recommended rate of the GDP towards defence, whereas America, I think, is giving between 3 and 4%.
Yes.
And so there very much is an argument that Europe isn't pulling its weight. And that is actually fair. I can understand that. But America isn't funding other countries necessarily, or at least it's not outside the national interest of America to be funding other countries, because where you don't necessarily have other countries spending the money and you're covering the cost, you have influence, you have power. It is within the national interest of the American administration to have influence in Europe. And so to come out questioning NATO really, one, puts a serious risk, or puts a serious dampener on European relations, and two, actually puts at risk, I would argue, the national interest of the states anyway.
I don't disagree, but I just don't see that getting through a conservative Congress.
I do wonder, though, if by the time Trump is in office by what's his defense secretary's name? Mathis.
Yeah, Mattis.
I saw that he started his job today. If he gets in and sees essentially what has been withheld from them, either being classified or top secret or whatever, suddenly they realise, oh, we really should be investing in NATO. In other words, I do wonder if there's a certain amount of information that a president learns upon taking office.
Right. I have I guess more faith in, which is I don't know why, but I guess I have more faith in Republicans to sort of realize or go back to their sort of red baiting roots that they sort of abandoned in the election cycle, but sort of get back to that and not back off NATO. I mean, I have a hard time believing that Republicans would decide to pull out of NATO.
I would agree with that, actually, and I do think that Trump would find a difficult time convincing most of his Republican congressmen. However, it is also the Republicans that tend to be moving towards a positive view of Russia and Putin, and I say like Republican voters more or less rather than Republican congressmen. But
that has switched in this election because, I mean, in the United States, unfortunately, nobody's really principled. It's all just playing for a team. So when the Democrats,
I think it's more than that though. Because
you do
because the reason why Putin is so powerful is one that he has a conservative moral ethic. So he legislates based on conservative morals. He builds up the state church, which is the Russian Orthodox Church, Christianity. And he is also a nationalist figure that has built Russia for the Russians. It's very much a Russia first mentality, and so there is actually an agreement ideologically between Putin and some of the more conservative members of the Republican Party, who want to legislate based on moral, conservative morals, who want to see more influence of religion in the state, and who want to build up America first for America's sake. So there is ideological similarity.
That's true. I guess I haven't really thought of it in that way because the Cold War has so much influenced conservative politics in the United States that...
No, that is fair. That might be enough influence.
It might be enough to hold it at bay. I mean, I guess my analysis of it was that the Democrats, who are traditionally not against... against cooperation with Russia, at least, sort of realizing that we can't be escalating with Russia. They were not the ones to do the Red Scare or McCarthyism, obviously. They sort of, started to switch because Hillary was being attacked by Russia. So, in my mind, I guess, maybe it's my American bubble because I'm, obviously I'm in it. But from my view, it's, especially with media, it looked to me more of a playing for a team, and because Russia was going against the Democrats, then the Republicans were more than willing to hop on board, and Democrats were more than willing to attack them. If it turns out to be more than that, then I'll have egg on my face. But I think that for now, we kind of have to wait and see on Russia. I was never really convinced. I mean, like we said last time, almost 50% of Democrats, according to a YouGov poll, believe that Russia literally changed the vote tallies, which is, right. We know that's nowhere near what happened. I mean, it was a hack of the DNC, and they, at most, gave those emails to WikiLeaks, So, yes, influence on the election? Yes. Directly changing the outcome of the election? No. Probably
not, yeah. No, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, those are legitimate concerns. We'll have to keep tabs on that, and I think this is something that we can flesh out more in our next episode, which will be on patriotism.
Sure. There is one more thing I would add here, in terms of kind of my thoughts on Europe in particular, is that with the perhaps not even the threat of Russia, but simply because Russia is there as a growing power, and because of essentially the EU being isolated from the Trump administration, I think it will actually begin to force through thoughts about a combined European military, so that the EU has a single military force. Actually, is all the more possible given that its biggest opponent is now Brexiting itself. out of the Union. So it is possible that we could see within the next couple of decades an actual unified European military.
Wow. I don't really know how to feel about that.
The Europe, if it continues as it is, will have 200 million more people than the United States, and only a little bit less, I think, maybe a few trillion less in terms of its GDP. So if Europe was actually to combine to become a superstate, then it would be one of the most powerful in the world. However, that is not a particularly popular option at this point. But with,
I would hope not.
Like I said, with Russia as a growing power and abandonment by America, it might actually force Germany, France, Spain, the rest of the EU countries to kind of pull together in terms of their military power as well.
Yeah, we'll obviously be keeping tabs on that. From the Americans' perspective, just as a recap of Trump's speech, I think, it was pretty short, but very effective. He knows his base very well. And just to prove how, his populist message resonated with the United States, he had some liberal aspects of the speech where he was talking about the negative effects of trade, of doing infrastructure projects. These are the sorts of things that won him states like Wisconsin, and breaking through the Democratic firewall. But obviously the overt nationalism, the isolationism, the America first only, sort of put a damper on the rest of those those reasonably liberal positions. And I think that's what we're going to get, a conservative, far to the right wing populist who does just enough to please the people, but also sort of beholden to his corporate donors and his friends and buddies. And I think you see that in his cabinet appointments alone. But Donald Trump obviously was not the only person to give an important speech last week. This was probably overshadowed by the inauguration, but Theresa May laid out what her strategy for Brexit.
That's right.
June the 23rd was not the moment Britain chose to step back from the world. It was the moment we chose to build a truly global Britain.
Brexit is back front and centre, and with it, I thought a brilliant speech. It was much needed, much anticipated. It brought clarity to what the government has been planning, and it brought in much needed certainty. We now know that we are headed for a hard Brexit, which essentially means that we know that the UK won't be in the European single market, and it probably won't be in the customs union either. It offered also a much needed positive narrative for Brexit, which, even though I don't actually agree with Brexit or leaving the EU, it was needed by the Brexit campaign. It's a good strategic speech. And it also put the EU on the back foot, as we'll see later on. But first, the argument for Brexit itself.
Many in Britain have always felt that the United Kingdom's place in the European Union came at the expense of our global ties and of a bolder embrace of free trade with the wider world.
As part of the EU, the UK cannot be its once dominant global self. Of course, you need to remember that within the British psyche is actually a former empire that ruled much of the world's people and much of the world's territory at the same time. Being part of the EU means that the UK can't actually make trade deals on its own. It can interact with other countries, it can form diplomatic relationships, but it can't, as part of a single market, as an independent market, which doesn't exist, make its own trade deals. And so it feels, the government feels, May's government feels, that we have been missing out, particularly with our old Commonwealth buddies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and India. India is a thriving economy that the EU hasn't actually had much interchange with. And so the UK wants to become that global trading machine that it once was. Of course, this wasn't the only reason why.
Our political traditions are different. Unlike other European countries, we have no written constitution, but the principle of parliamentary sovereignty is the basis of our unwritten constitutional settlement. We have only a recent history of devolved governance, though it has rapidly embedded itself. and we have little history of coalition government. The public expect to be able to hold their governments to account very directly. And as a result, supranational institutions, as strong as those created by the European Union, sit very uneasily in relation to our political history and way of life.
This is largely true. Britain has never been comfortable with the European Union setup. It's always kind of been the fish out of water, kind of the little thumb off the side. It never really fit in with the gang, and this is largely why. The European Union has 3 different branches within it: the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. Now, the European Parliament is an elected body of representatives chosen by the electorate from each of the 28 different countries. The European Council is the group of leaders from each of the governments in the country. So Theresa May herself is a member of the council, as is Angela Merkel and François Hollande from France. However, the European Commission is essentially the executive body, and that is an unelected group. And so if you ever hear someone, a leaver perhaps, talk about Eurocrats, this is who they're talking about. It's a group of unelected officials that are tasked with creating legislation for the European Union. Now, of course, legislation can't actually be passed until it's passed by the Parliament, and ultimately the Council has the final say, but still, none of these other 2 groups, institutions, have the ability to create law. And so this does sit uneasy with the British people, who can hold their governments to account. It's very easy, relatively, in comparison to other, say, presidential systems, for instance, to get rid of your government and replace it with a new one. So it's actually a fairly good point. Further, on a positive note.
So to our friends across Europe, let me say this. Our vote to leave the European Union was no rejection of the values we share. The decision to leave the EU represents no desire to become more distant to you, our friends and neighbours. It was no attempt to do harm to the EU itself or to any of its remaining member states. We do not want to turn the clock back to the days when Europe was less peaceful, less secure, and less able to trade freely. It was a vote to restore, as we see it, our parliamentary democracy, national self-determination, and to become even more global and internationalist in action and in spirit. We will continue to be reliable partners, willing allies and close friends. We want to buy your goods and services, sell you ours, trade with you as freely as possible, and work with one another to make sure we are all safer, more secure, and more prosperous through continued friendship. You will still be welcome in this country, as we hope our citizens will be welcome in yours. At a time when together we face a serious threat from our enemies, Britain's unique intelligence capabilities will continue to help to keep people in Europe safe from terrorism. And at a time when there is growing concern about European security, Britain's servicemen and women based in European countries, including Estonia, Poland, and Romania, will continue to do their duty. We are leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. And that is why we seek a new and equal partnership between an independent, self-governing global Britain and our friends and allies in the EU.
So you see, we don't want to leave you. We just want to be the gold-digging girlfriend that avoids further commitment because, well, to be honest, you smell kind of funny, but hey, you got cash. So, do you mind maybe sending some of that a little bit my way, sweetums? Well, whatever you think of the ultimate intent, the rhetoric is actually a much needed boost to the pro-Brexit side, and it does kind of enshrine a little bit more confidence in perhaps the Remainers here in the UK that, you know, perhaps we still can actually relate to the EU well. Maybe we can actually trade really freely. Maybe they can send their products and their money and buy our services and all this good stuff without us having to take on the other aspects of the European Union, like perhaps immigration. It's like, we don't want you, we just want your money. And even if it envisages all the benefits and none of the sacrifices, it at least sees the UK as a friendly counterpart to the EU27, particularly when it comes to trade. I think, John, you'd be quite happy to hear this in science. So things like European space exploration will still be a joint effort.
That's
along
awesome.
with clean energy and other scientific endeavours. The UK and the EU27, the remaining nations, would still be working together on these points.
Yeah, I mean, because they're rational human beings for the most part.
Mostly.
Well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the space programs out of Europe. As an aside, I mean, they landed a probe literally on a comet, like 3 billion miles away.
Crash landed more?
It did crash land, but it still operated for a while. I mean,
That's true.
Okay, fine. You go crash land. You go land a probe on a comet, and then you come back and you offer some criticism.
Fair enough. Speaking of being rational,
is that the kind of agreement I have described today is the economically rational thing that both Britain and the EU should aim for. Because trade is not a zero-sum game. More of it makes us all more prosperous. Free trade between Britain and the European Union means more trade means more jobs and more wealth creation. The erection of new barriers to trade, meanwhile, means the reverse. Less trade, fewer jobs, lower growth.
this is arguably true, and it makes a lot of sense as well. It would make sense for both the EU and the UK to keep their open trade agreements as much as possible, arguably. The minimisation of trade as it currently happens now would only hurt both the European and UK economies and cost jobs. So why would you want to take a step back in terms of trade? However, on a more negative note, and probably to answer that question.
In the last decade or so, we've seen record levels of net migration in Britain. And that sheer volume has put pressure on public services like schools, stretched our infrastructure, especially housing, and put a downward pressure on wages for working class people. As Home Secretary for 6 years, I know that you cannot control immigration overall when there is free movement to Britain from Europe. Britain is an open and tolerant country. We will always want immigration, especially high-skilled immigration. We will always want immigration from Europe, and we will always welcome individual migrants as friends. But the message from the public before and during the referendum campaign was clear. Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come to Britain from Europe, and that is what we will deliver. Fairness demands that we deal with another issue as soon as possible, too. We want to guarantee the rights of EU citizens who are already living in Britain.
So it really is a we want your money and not you approach. And while she certainly gives platitudes as to the people that do come here, the skilled workers and the individuals that we all kind of make friends with, she's quite clear that she doesn't want people immigrating across. It's very much the UKIP approach. It's categorising entire groups of people as something and then saying we do not want you.
I mean, this echoes of things that we hear in the United States all the time from conservatives, where immigration, particularly, I don't know how badly you suffer from illegal immigration, but illegal immigration, very liberal immigration policies in the United States, letting a lot of people in. We have the same narrative of a race to the bottom, driving wages down because these people are taking on, American jobs. They took our jobs.
Yeah, that's right.
But the problem is when you look at it, and I don't know how this is in Britain, but in the United States, most of these jobs that they're taking are agricultural, and even in Southern California, the agriculture industry almost it rides on the backs of immigrants who are paid a lot less than average Americans would accept. But I don't know what drives the British economy. I imagine you guys don't do a ton of agriculture.
There is agriculture, and it is a fairly significant section of our economy, but not nearly as big as what the US can produce. Interestingly, the UK has, I think, the highest rate or the highest number of unskilled labourers of any. I'm not sure if it's OECD country or any maybe vaguely major economy in the world, and when you have immigration coming in from Europe, largely folks who would have voted for Brexit, I think, are largely arguing against your kind of Eastern European nations. They're largely coming in as unskilled labourers. And it's not an illegal thing either, but this is the problem that people had with the European Union, is that there can be an unlimited influx of people from all over the European continent. And when there are jobs in the UK, particularly unskilled labour-like jobs, then folks are just coming into the country to take them, or so the argument goes. So the economy itself is actually quite interesting, because it's not simple agricultural work, it's just unskilled labour. It's, construction, it's cleaning, it's
yeah, much different than in the United States. I mean, these agriculture jobs I was talking about, a lot of people, they decry immigration, but they don't realize that the reason our food is so cheap is because production is cheap because of immigrant labor. Well,
and what can't happen here is, or at least shouldn't be happening here, is that no European citizen can come to the country and take a lower wage, although I'm sure it does happen kind of under the table agreements, but because they should be and are treated like British citizens. That's part of the agreements of being in the European Union.
Right.
Now, one of the other things that the speech kind of went on to do is supposedly taking a look at the protections that can be offered to workers.
And a fairer Britain is a country that protects and enhances the rights people have at work. That is why, as we translate the body of European law into our domestic regulations, we will ensure that workers' rights are fully protected and maintained. Indeed, under my leadership, not only will the government protect the rights of workers set out in European legislation, we will build on them. Because under this Conservative government, we will make sure legal protection for workers keeps pace with the changing labour market, and that the voices of workers are heard by the boards of publicly listed companies for the first time.
It's honestly quite funny to hear a Conservative run with this type of argument, given their track record, which is abysmal in terms of workers' rights. They are literally anti-labour union. Even the most recent one, for instance, was the argument over the junior doctors' contracts, which led hundreds, if not thousands, of junior doctors to go on strike because they were being forced, or their new contract would force them into working weekends and evenings, essentially unsociable hours, for no increase in pay. They are a government that has continued to uphold 0-hour contracts, essentially contracts that you sign that don't actually guarantee you any hours, and so they're not able to guarantee you essentially a living.
Nice.
Yeah, exactly. There's also been this odd paradox in the UK, or at least in Europe as a whole, whereby European countries are seeing a fall in the number of jobs being held, the number of people in employment, whereas that's been going up in the UK. At the same time, though, the wages in Europe have been rising and wages in the UK have been going down. And essentially, this is largely due to the British economy taking on a lot of part-time, unskilled jobs. And so it's jobs like your part-time supermarket workers that earn the minimum, not even the living wage. I know this because I was a part-time supermarket worker. And so you've seen this dramatic fall in wages throughout the Conservatives' time in office since 2010. Here's a few other things. They have tried to introduce no-fault dismissal legislation, which was only ended up being blocked by the Lib Dems when they were in coalition between 2010 and 2015. They reduced the amount of time that employers needed to consult on collective redundancies from 90 days to 45 days. They removed all legal aid for employment cases, except in cases brought for discrimination. And they brought in a Shares for Rights scheme, which essentially allowed workers to give up their basic employment rights in exchange for company shares. If you're interested in kind of reading more about that, that's leftfootforward.org. So you'll be able to find an article on on that there. Of course, that article in particular goes on to make the argument that the Conservatives aren't actually in a bad place relative to their ability to be the party of the working class, largely because the party of the working class, i.e. Labour, has abandoned its base. But nonetheless, I digress a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of times. I mean, I look at the Conservatives over in the UK, and they don't often look like the Conservatives in the United States, because at least they say that they're for, universal healthcare and things like that. But this is typical sort of conservative stuff that you get over here too.
But it's unusual for here.
Really?
Oh yeah. So this is a kind of a brand new thing, it might have happened in the past, but it definitely feels new, because you would never have the working class, the working people voting Conservative. Never in a million years would you think that would be the case. And yet, nowadays, perhaps taking a leaf out of the Conservatives' hat from America, they're beginning to put together a rhetoric that is actually pulling across working people to the right-wing parties, i.e. the Conservatives and UKIP.
So you think that UKIP is having more influence on public opinion then?
Well, I actually think that the Conservatives are having the most influence in public opinion because Theresa May has been seen as a safe pair of hands. The Labour Party has largely abandoned the working class. It's become a very professional class party. It now has a leader that is essentially Trotskyist, who is very far left. And that just doesn't pull votes from the centre, which Labour beforehand had.
Yeah,
so,
it's very similar to what's happening in the United States. The Conservatives are going off the deep end to the right, and the Liberals are becoming so out of touch with average Americans and their base that they're just falling out of power faster than anybody, or I would have thought that was possible.
I'll agree with you on the left, but when in terms of the Conservative jumping off the deep end, they're not so much jumping off the deep end here as just providing a stable set of hands in an unsure environment. I think Theresa May has done well to use her position to exude stability and calm and confidence. That's why I think this speech in particular is so important, it's so good, is that it actually brought a bit of stability and certainty to what was otherwise unstable and uncertain.
Right, which is what people want and need right now.
Exactly. And which the left, as we perhaps diagnosed in our postmortem in our last episode, just doesn't get the policies it's pursuing. Yeah, exactly. The policies that they're pursuing are leading to more uncertainty and more instability. Anyway, so this is still part of May's speech where, kind of the negative sides of what she's planning is that, there won't actually be any immigration into the UK, or at least that's their starting point. Workers' rights are supposedly a thing, but considering that the powers to defend workers' rights are coming back to the Conservatives, there might not actually be that many workers' rights. And here is now kind of the crux, the climax of the speech itself.
But I want to be clear. What I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market.
And
it is true that full customs union membership prevents us from negotiating our own comprehensive trade deals. Now, I want Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade agreements. But I also want tariff-free trade with Europe and cross-border trade there to be as frictionless as possible. That means I do not want Britain to be part of the common commercial policy, and I do not want us to be bound by the common external tariff. These are the elements of the customs union that prevent us from striking our own comprehensive trade agreements with other countries. But I do want us to have a customs agreement with the EU.
So we now know that Brexit means Brexit. Britain is coming out of the single market and probably coming out of the customs union as well, and it's here that the EU might have been put in the back foot. Right after the referendum, the European countries were adamant in the stance that you can't have the free movement of goods without the free movement of people. And here Theresa May is coming out and saying, oh yeah, we knew that. That's kind of our starting negotiating position. And so it just kind of dampens the argument. Of course, the European Union nations have been very disciplined in their approach to the negotiations so far. Europe, the other 27 nations, aren't allowed in any way to communicate or to negotiate with Britain before Article 50 has been triggered. And so there you have it. We now know that the UK is heading towards the hard Brexit door that will see its economy isolated in a way that it hasn't been in 40 years, and it's difficult to say what the future holds for the British economy. Its future health is kind of dependent on the lines that are being drawn now as the triggering of Article 50 approaches. And unfortunately, from my end anyway,
a stronger Britain demands that we do something else. Strengthen the precious union between the four nations of the United Kingdom. At this momentous time, it is more important than ever that we face the future together, united by what makes us strong, the bonds that unite us as a people, and our shared interest in the UK being an open, successful trading nation in the future.
So May's Brexit plan also includes a closer union of the four constituent nations of the UK, which might not be heard particularly well in the rather pro-EU, single market area of the country, i.e. Scotland, that also happens to have a rather strong pro-independence movement going with it as well. Perhaps one that one half of this transatlantic podcast duo might perhaps back.
Not that you're biased or
not
anything.
Not that I'm biased in any way
a
whatsoever.
vested interest.
None at all. So, John, any final thoughts on May's particular speech, or this particular speech?
Well, I guess the only thing I would ask is, so based off of her speech, based off of things I've heard from economists and things I've read about Brexit, and what I know about conservative parties in general, would you say that Brexit might not necessarily be a terrible thing? It's just that the people in power can't be trusted, and their track record is so abysmal that it's not going to end up being a good thing.
It's kind of an odd thing. It's Brexit in and of itself might or might not be a bad thing, in the same way that the European Union might or might not be a bad thing. And what I mean by that is it ultimately depends on the direction of the philosophies backing either the British government or the EU. I'm not sure if you remember this in one of our courses. I don't think we took it together, but did you ever read Creation Regained?
By Walter?
By Walters, yeah.
Yes, I did.
All right, so his big thesis. Go ahead.
Okay, side note, that book, I literally used that book to convince my parents to start recycling. My super conservative parents who don't believe in climate change, believe that the earth is literally created for man to use. I got them to start recycling by reading that book. Well, it was actually transformational. Go ahead.
Well, that is brilliant, because this book is also brilliant. Now, the main thesis of the book is Walter's argument of structure versus direction. And now in the particular context of the book, it's the structures of things in the world themselves are not good nor bad. It's the direction in which they're heading. For him, it's towards God or it's away from God. Now, we can use the same type of metaphor or the same type of mechanism here, I guess. Structure versus direction. The structure of the European Union isn't necessarily bad or good. The structure of the British government and an independent British economy in itself is not bad or good. The direction, however, is ultimately important. And so Brexit is a bad thing, because the government into which the powers are being placed, I believe, are moving in a direction away from progressivism and liberalism. I think we'll see not necessarily damage to the economy, but a widening of the inequality gap, for instance. I think you'll see less workers' rights. I think we'll see more anti-Muslim, anti-non-white rhetoric come out of it. Whereas at the moment, in terms of the direction of the European Union, we have the European Court of Justice, which means that if I feel as if my rights are being infringed upon by my government, the UK government, I can actually appeal it to the EU. You take that away and suddenly the British government is, or at least the British judiciary is the last port of call in terms of appealing any case. But if at any point the European Union decides to turn away from its progressive and liberal values, that too will become a sinking ship that I will jump off in without any hesitancy whatsoever. So it is actually particularly down to the current state of things. But because of that, because of the context, then yes, I think Brexit will be rather unfortunate. I think it'll be a loss, a net loss. Britain will have stuff to gain, but it'll be a net loss.
I feel the same way about a Trump presidency, to be honest with you. I feel like there's very few things that he'll probably be good on, like infrastructure, if he follows through on that, not defunding Social Security, maybe even expanding it. But other than that, I think it's the overwhelming bent of the political mood in the country is going conservative, and I think that, ultimately we'll be worse off for it.
Finally, we'll end this rather encouraging week for the populist right wing with a story out of Germany. Deutsche Welle reports that the right-wing populist group in the European Parliament has held a convention in the European city of Koblenz. And that was actually just today. Well, the Europe of Nations and Freedom group is the smallest group in the European Parliament with only 40 seats out of 750. More than 1,000 right-wing leaders and activists from across Europe were in attendance. Attendees included Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front in France, who is also a candidate and actually the current front-runner in polls for the French presidential race. Don't worry, that's only the first set of presidential votes. There are two.
Nothing final.
Nothing final. She probably won't win, but she might get into the second round. Let's put it that way. Geert Wilders of the anti-Islam Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, Matteo Salvini of Italy's anti-EU Northern League, and most interestingly, Frauke Petry of the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany party. Petry's attendance at the convention is noteworthy as her AfD party only joined the populist group in May of last year. The AfD actually only started as an anti-euro, that's the currency party, but under her leadership it's kind of taken a swing out to the right, becoming a more anti-establishment and anti-immigrant party. This week's convention is a show of strength for the right wing in Europe as it prepares for a very important electoral year with elections in the Netherlands, France and Germany. It's a warning to the European establishment saying we are ready and we are enthusiastic. The new patriotic spring, as it's so called by Geert Wilders himself, like Trump, couches patriotism in vague terms. What is patriotism and who gets to define it? They do. And anyone who disagrees with them is unpatriotic and unnationalistic. The irony of the convention, of course, is that a group of parties and politicians from across the nations of Europe are coming together to confer with and support each other so that they can then go out and attempt to further drive apart the nations that they represent. This is the undying irony and paradox of the right wing in Europe at the moment. So,
oh, God.
Yep, it's there. It's a thing.
That's great.
Anyway.
Well, that makes me feel so good. Just end it on a positive note.
Ending
I'm sure that
on a positive note for the right wing populist. That's why I started.
Right.
There we go. Okay, good.
I'm sure that we'll be touching back on this on our next episode, which unfortunately our next full episode won't be until February 6th now. We'll be tackling the topic of patriotism, and I'm sure we'll each be giving our own definition. And we will be talking about news stories of patriotism and nationalism across the world, and kind of giving our breakdown of that.
That's right. And in between times, we'll also have a special live stream. Sometime next week, we'll announce the date on Twitter at Commoners Pod, but it'll be sometime over the weekend next time. Of course, we'll release the episode as a podcast itself on Monday, and during that we'll be taking the political compass quiz, just kind of chatting about our political beliefs, and it'll just be very informal, but it should be fun. I'm very interested to hear what John actually thinks it.
Yeah, I am looking forward to it because the logistics of this podcast are horrendous.
Yes,
because you are 5 hours ahead of me. I have 2 kids who don't nap at the right time, and they need to go have play dates at when I when I'm going to be recording this. I mean, you have to have your son in bed.
Yep. He needs to be down.
Yeah, so the logistics are terrible, but your wife is going away next weekend, so we're going to basically be able to do it whenever is convenient, right?
That's right. So date still to be confirmed. That is why there's an unconfirmed date as of yet. Anyway.
All right, so that's it, I think, for today. If you like this episode, you can follow us on Twitter at CommonersPod for daily news and updates on upcoming episodes. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube for any live streams or YouTube exclusive content. The music for today's episode is Not For Nothing by Otis McDonald. Be sure to check out the description for a link to the rest of his work. Adam, it's been a pleasure. Have a good night.
As always.
Until next time, stay informed.
Please clap.